All right, everyone, welcome to today's research seminar here at a16z Crypto Research. Very excited for today's talk. It's by our very own Valeria Nikolaenko. She's going to give a two-part survey about proof-of-stake blockchain. So the first one is now, and then the other one will be Thursday at the same time, so 11 a.m. Eastern. So definitely check that out as well. And very excited to hear about this. On the one hand, very central topic in Web3. On the other hand, I think still fairly poorly understood. So, Lara.
Fantastic, thank you for this introduction. So this talk here will be a survey of proof-of-stake blockchains. The main purpose of this talk will be to map the landscape, to kind of get the view of the land so that you know how it all looks like, and we'll be able to map new consensus protocols into this landscape. This is a very vast topic and can easily substitute a semester course, so I will be touching the tips here. But hopefully you'll get a general sense. So I was trying to balance the talk between academic papers, white papers, talks, blog posts, so to make it a little bit more lively and interesting and less academic. But of course, if you're interested in specifics of any protocols that I'm going to describe, please look at the papers for more rigorous analysis of why this works. So this tutorial will also help understand somewhat a little bit a deep dive that I will give on Thursday about mitigating the long-range attacks for proof-of-stake blockchains. So this is the outline. The talk will be subdivided into a few topics that are somewhat independent, so if you lose me on one, you can always catch up on the other. Roughly, I'll start with some pathway into the proof-of-stake by comparing it to proof-of-work and sort of motivating why we want to move to proof-of-stake and what are the new properties that these blockchain systems give us. Then I'm going to describe two most popular approaches to designing proof-of-stake blockchains, which is Nakamoto protocols, very similar to proof-of-work. They're sometimes called longest chain consensus protocols or fork choice rule consensus. And also BFT protocol is another popular approach. I'll then focus on leader election strategies or committee election strategies and blockchain randomness. This will be somewhat a little bit more technical. And then finally, we will look at different possible attacks that the proof-of-stake design enables that were not possible with proof-of-work blockchains. Okay, so let's start with proof-of-work versus proof-of-stake. Hopefully this will be easy. Proof-of-work blockchain, you'll probably know, it starts with the genesis block and the blocks are built on top of other blocks forming a tree. And so each miner, it needs to pick one path through this tree to extend this path with another block. So it exercises the fork choice rule to select a path in the tree, and to get the right to extend the chain with a new block, it needs to solve a computational puzzle that's hard to solve but easy to verify. And solving the puzzle, what allows them to extend the chain by one more block. So you notice in this consensus, we get total ordering of all of the transactions. So transactions are ordered within a block, and then the blocks are ordered. So everything has total order at the end. It doesn't have to be this way. Some transactions are actually independent, so potentially can be run in parallel, and we'll see some modern consensus protocols are trying to do partial ordering, but not total ordering. But proof-of-work is doing total ordering. And another interesting thing to note about the proof-of-work system is that the miner who joins it needs to figure out what's the longest chain. It needs to verify all the cryptographic puzzles along the way to figure out what's the latest block to build on top of, unless it's willing to trust a centralized checkpoint. So with proof-of-work, miner spends a lot of money on the infrastructure, paying electricity bills, and also buying special mining hardware. So you can envision as if the money are kind of leaving the protocol into the physical world. And this infrastructure allows the miner to participate in building the blockchain. And the reward that the miner gets is proportional to its computational power. So if it doubles on its infrastructure, then his reward will double. So the more money he spends on the infrastructure, the larger is his reward. And the whole idea of the proof-of-stake blockchain is, why don't we eliminate this physical component altogether and kind of circle this money just directly back into the protocol by just locking the same amount of money as stake, and then the reward that we give to good miners that honestly participate will be proportional to the stake that they has locked to participate. Okay, so that's the high-level idea. So to compare proof of work to proof of stake roughly, so a bit of terminology, we call miners in proof of work the nodes who help build the blockchain, and validators in proof of stake. The reward is proportional to computational power in proof of work, but proportional to stake in proof of stake. And then what the miners are doing in proof of stake is they validating and executing transactions, same as in proof of work, except they are not solving these expensive computational puzzles. So that's why proof of stake blockchains are very energy efficient. Their Byzantine threshold that the blockchains can handle is roughly the same. So to attack the proof of work, you need to compromise some significant portion of computational power. And for proof of stake, you need to compromise some significant portion of stake. But the world is still, despite all the benefits of proof of stake, is still mostly proof of work. So if you look at the cryptocurrencies by market cap, about 57% of them are still doing proof of work. So Bitcoin is the largest and Ethereum is the second largest. But Ethereum plans to move to proof of stake somewhere this year, hopefully. So this will be the largest proof of stake cryptocurrency after they make the merge. And we'll be focusing on this right rectangle of protocols, including the Ethereum consensus layer. So just a little bit more about electricity consumption and how bad it is. So some of the latest numbers, the Bitcoin is consuming 85 terawatts an hour and Ethereum 112. That's comparable to the size of the Argentina, which consumes 130. But to be fair, it's still less combined than mining gold, which is 240 terawatts an hour. And also, if you look at how the hash rate climbs up of the Bitcoin network, and hash rate is directly proportional to electricity consumption, is it climbs up very, very rapidly, especially in the last couple of years. So if it continues climbing up this way, you can start worry about sustainability of this whole blockchain. If it doesn't worry you now, maybe it will start to worry you sometime soon. Less electricity loss with proof of stake is, I guess, the major selling point, but not the only one. Also, mining becomes cheaper. So if you look at the numbers, currently Ethereum is paying 2% of the total supply of coins to its miners annually, and Bitcoin is paying 1.5%. So that's a lot of stake, a lot of rewards going to miners. With mining becoming cheaper, these rewards can probably be made lower. Another good thing about proof of stake blockchains, some protocols have much faster finality and larger throughput. So as you all know, Bitcoin and Ethereum are not so good in terms of finality and throughput. You need to wait, like, for example, these are coin-based numbers, so you need to wait 3 blocks on top of your transaction in Bitcoin and 35 blocks in Ethereum. So that makes the finality times about 30 minutes for Ethereum, or 30 minutes for Bitcoin and 9 minutes for Ethereum. And then the transaction throughput is also really low. With proof of stake, potentially, you can have finality in seconds and be able to do thousands of transactions a second. Then we'll look which protocols are achieving that performance. It's also arguably easier to launch new projects with proof of stake consensus because you don't need to acquire a lot of miners to support your chain. So it's still challenging, but it's somewhat easier than proof of work. Yes?
I guess one could just increase the block size of the proof of work chain.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a slide on that, but I removed it for the sake of time. But you're right, there are research directions that are trying to improve the proof of work blockchain by increasing the block size or decreasing the frequency at which the blocks are allowed to be produced, like decreasing the difficulty puzzles. The problem with that is that when you start growing your block size, it takes longer to propagate through the network. And so it's more likely that other miners will find blocks at the same height, and the chain will fork more as a result. So the worry, I guess, the main worry of the people who are opposing increasing the block size is the fact that the chain will be less reliable. But also there are other research directions trying to improve the proof of work. For example, instead of solving this useless computational puzzle of finding pre-images of the hash function, you can do maybe something useful. And there are some ideas around help fault proteins or help figure out transportation and such. So some interesting research direction, like substituting the puzzle for something useful. Because if you think about it, the infrastructure is already built and we have all this kind of hardware. People figured out the logistics with electricity. It's kind of a waste that they're having all that there, kind of wasting it and solving stupid kind of hash puzzles. Instead, why don't we maybe repurpose them to solving something useful? Would be kind of nice. So that's another approach of maybe improving the proof of work.
On the topic of block size that Justin mentioned, I mean, I feel like that's almost like an orthogonal dimension compared to like proof of work versus proof of stake, I feel like. Because proof of stake blockchains, you also have to worry about, is the block rate, is the block size bigger or smaller? How do we feel about propagation delay? And so I guess, but so a different thing is just kind of like, what is the minimal computation requirements just to like validate the chain, right? So that's something that comes up, I guess. So like one thing that's maybe, so Bitcoin and Ethereum, I feel like both of them want to make sure that it's very easy to be able to just sort of follow along, so that you don't need like a crazy supercomputer. And I feel like that's a completely orthogonal design dimension to like the choice of proof of work. Is there any connection between those two, or does that seem? Yeah,
especially those proof of stake protocols that mimic proof of work, they will have the same problem. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Fantastic. So let me mention the desired consensus properties or blockchain properties that we want before we kind of see the designs of these blockchains. So of course we want safety, so miners need to agree on history, on some common prefix of the chain. You want to have liveness, so every valid transaction should eventually get added to the chain and you should have no censorship ideally. You should be able to tolerate some percentage of Byzantine miners, adversarial miners who are trying to disrupt the protocol. And finally, you would want to have some minimal network assumption for safety and liveness to hold. And Andy was giving great seminar talks about all of that in more detail, but I want to mention it here still, just so that we are able to map the consensus protocols I'm going to be describing into this properties, see what properties they have. So in terms of network assumptions, people usually look at 3 different models. First is synchronous. It's the best for academics because it's easy to design protocols in this model. There is a known bound delta network delay and a shared global clock. So if you think for a bit, from first glance, it doesn't seem like this model of the internet very well, because sometimes we have very large delays between the nodes, or there are network partitions and such. But since the protocols are typically designed to tolerate some number of Byzantine miners, you can hide, the network delay that's larger than delta inside your Byzantine assumption. So maybe in practice, sometimes synchronous network is still a good model, because if 2 nodes have delay larger than delta, you can just assume this are Byzantine. As long as you don't violate the threshold of Byzantine nodes, you're good with a synchronous assumption.
So it's like, for example, you're saying, like, suppose 10% of the nodes really were Byzantine, and 20% of the nodes just had a crappy internet connection.
Exactly.
That would be fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Another kind of better model is partial synchronous, where we know there exists a bound delta, we just don't know what it is, and also shared global clock again. So nice thing about this property is protocols designed in this model, they cannot depend on delta. So they cannot have any forking based on delta. They cannot do any action based on how much time has passed compared to delta. But the properties, we can reason still about, for example, finality in terms of delta. So we can prove properties about this consensus protocol and partially synchronous model based on delta. So the better the delta, the better are the consensus protocols. And finally, asynchronous protocols. These are the best because they make no assumptions about the network, and they also subsume network partitions. And actually, it's a very active area of research right now, building consensus protocols in a synchronous network. I'll explain why this is possible in just a second. So I wanted also to very briefly mention possibility and possibility results, because we start feeling the bounds of what is possible to do with consensus in different network models. So in synchrony, it's possible to achieve both liveness and safety with any Byzantine threshold. Even if everyone except one node is Byzantine, you can still achieve consensus. But the consensus becomes particularly efficient linear time when the number of Byzantine threshold is less than half. In partial synchrony, we also know how to build great protocols with Byzantine threshold under a third. And in asynchrony, unfortunately, there was an impossibility, FLP impossibility result showing that you cannot achieve neither safety nor liveness even if you have a single Byzantine node. But there's actually a way around this impossibility result if you build a common randomness source, if you build a common coin for the nodes. Yeah, so this has to involve some cryptography. And this is being done, actually, maybe this year or last year. Some protocols start being practical for building common randomness. We will touch a little bit on how they look like, but asynchronous protocol, asynchronous consensus kind of becomes possible. So typically we're fine with synchrony or partial synchrony models, and most of the protocols will be using one of them. But typically people worry about network partitions. So what if there's some disastrous event and two countries get disconnected, maybe transatlantic cable gets broken or something, or maybe a large country builds a firewall around itself. Then you have a network partition and large portion of nodes start being disconnected from another portion. That's kind of a variant of asynchronous network, but turns out you can have, in this particular restricted asynchronous network, you can still preserve one of the two, either liveness or safety. And we'll see which protocols prefer which one. So our goal will be to design protocols for this network. For partial synchrony, that will prefer one of this, safety or liveness, but have both when the network doesn't have a partition. Cool. So the proof of work that I was describing fits into the synchronous model. At least it was only proven to be live and safe in synchrony, and can tolerate up to 50% of Byzantine nodes. And then in the event of a network partition, it prefers liveness. So that's how proof of work fits into the picture. Okay, so now I will describe two popular approaches to proof of stake consensus. First one is Nakamoto consensus. It was pioneered by Peercoin and sort of extensively studied from academic standpoint in family of Ouroboros papers. It is very similar to proof of work in that it has a fork choice rule, similar to proof of work. So finality is eventual or probabilistic. You need to wait some k number of blocks to be built on top of your chain to be sure that your transaction has been finalized. And the larger this k, the higher is your assurance that the block will not be reverted.
So just to clear, Ouroboros, so that's in Cardano, is that right?
Yeah. Communication, though, in this consensus protocols is really low, usually linear, but even better than linear. I'll explain in just a second. And the number of nodes that you can handle is limitless. You can, this consensus can work when the number of validators is over 1,000 easily. And in the event of network partition, it favors liveness over safety. So it will continue finalizing transactions, it's just that two partitions will diverge and be building two conflicting forks.
So what do you mean when you say the number of nodes will be limitless? You mean without massive slowdown or something?
Well, let me explain the other, and then you will see what it means. Maybe it will be more clear. So the other approach is BFT consensus, built on PBFT, although PBFT was not a blockchain protocol. It was adapted to be a blockchain protocol by Tendermint first. And then Hot Stuff sort of conceptualized Tendermint and also built a responsive protocol from Tendermint. So these are the most notable protocols, but there are also others that are being published now. So finality with BFT consensus is immediate. Sometimes it will take longer to get finality if your network conditions are bad, if you start seeing delays. Or if the network is under attack, but if the conditions are good, your finality will be extremely fast. And once you get assurance that your transaction is final, there is no way it's going to get reverted. So finality is deterministic. Communication is very high because each validator needs to be connected to every other validator, so they need to form a clique to answer your question. The higher the number of validators, the heavier the protocol becomes. So typically the protocol limit the number of validators by about 100, like 20 to 40 is a good number for a performance system. So the more nodes you have, the slower is the consensus. And in the event of network partitions, this protocol favors safety over liveness. So if there's a network partition, the protocol will just halt and not produce any new blocks until the network is restored. At least it will not be finalizing conflicting transactions, so safety is preserved. And on the communication side, in Nakamoto consensus, you can have flexible network topology. So one node can be connected to some constant number of other nodes, and they can be connected to a constant number of other nodes. So typically, when a node announces something to the network, it sends it to its peers, and the peers send to the peers, etc. So although it takes longer to propagate through this whole network, you have kind of longer network delays this way from reaching the periphery. Still, the burden on each node is lower because you're only sending something to a constant number of peers and you're listening to a constant number of peers. Whereas in BFT consensus, where everybody is connected to everybody, first of all, you need to open channels, so there's a lot of channels to maintain. But the good thing is that these channels don't have to be authenticated. Just by the nature of these BFT protocols, all the messages are signed, so you don't need to additionally open TLS connections. You don't need to additionally MAC or do message authentication codes on these messages. So in that way, maybe you can build a more efficient network layer if you don't need authenticated channels.
So with BFT, you could do more flexible version of some of the like an honest path between each pair of honest nodes. I mean,
yeah, you're right. Maybe, yeah. As long as, you need to be sure, it's well connected, but definitely you can do the kind of the gossip style as well.
So sort of like logically, that's what the network should look like.
Yeah.
Right, and like maybe each of those edges maps down to a physical path of multiple hops, I guess. Right.
Okay. Yeah, so BFT can be ported to this topology. I guess that's most frequently people do this kind of communication. But yeah, you're right. So the other way is not true. Like the Nakamoto consensus can work also with this network topology, but it doesn't do this. I think none of the protocols do this topology for Nakamoto consensus. But indeed, some of the protocols, BFT protocols, can adopt this flexible.
Right, it's maybe one way to think about these two pictures. So like longest chain, right? Basically, just whoever created the block has to tell everybody else, and everybody else doesn't have to talk to each other at all, basically, about that block.
Right.
Whereas like BFT, everybody's like voting, and everybody has to know everybody's votes to make progress. And so the communication pattern looks kind of more all-to-all. Is that reasonable? Or?
Yeah, that's a reasonable assumption. Although, like Atendi was saying, if you can tolerate larger network delays, you can wait for, the consensus decision to reach you through multiple hops.
Right. I guess, but I could interpret those graphs actually as just sort of like the communication patterns, I guess, in some sense.
Okay,
so
right.
I can interpret the sort of complete graph as kind of everybody needs to keep track of what everybody else is doing because they're voting and counting votes and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's very formal. Yeah, that's a very good way to phrase it. Okay. So I thought it would be fun to kind of look at the blockchains by market cap and see what they are. So I took 30 blockchain projects ordered by market cap, and let's remove the ERC20 tokens that don't have their own consensus and see what the rest are. So this is my best effort. I really apologize if I messed something up here. Sometimes the projects, they incorporate the ideas both from Nakamoto consensus and BFT consensus, so it's a little hard to say what exactly they are. Some of them also don't document their consensus that well, but this is my best effort. Correct me if you see any mistakes. So you can color code them as well. So the yellow ones are the proof of work blockchains, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dogecoin, Litecoin, Ethereum Classic, Monero, Bitcoin Cash. The green ones are BFT protocols or BFT-style, so Binance, XRP. Although Ripple is not quite BFT-style, it's a little bit different, but has the BFT characteristics. Polygon, Kronos, Cosmos are BFT. Algorand is sort of BFT, but it's so different from the rest that I'm going to focus on Algorand a little bit more later on. And the Purple ones are Nakamoto consensus, so Cardano, Solana, Polkadot, Tron, Near protocol. You notice there are 3 that are not colored, and those are, as I said, different consensus protocols that are harder to map to this paradigm: Avalanche, Stellar, and Algorand. But roughly speaking, most of the time you can classify the consensus protocol in one of these 3 categories.
So just to clarify, so when you say BFT, you also mean proof of stake, is that right?
Sorry, yes, BFT is proof of stake and Nakamoto is proof of stake.
No, so BFT means proof of stake, BFT, and Nakamoto means
proof of stake.
chain.
Also proof of stake.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, it's a little confusing because proof of work is also Nakamoto style consensus. But yeah, the green and purple ones are all proof of stake.
So Solana, I have to say, I think of as BFT more.
Yeah, so I spent quite some time trying to figure out, and they actually have some fork choice rules that they define in their protocol, so it definitely has some Nakamoto style component to it. Maybe some of the other parts are more BFT style, or maybe they combine the two. Yeah, it would be nice to figure out what exactly they do. I guess they're in the process of documenting what they do somewhat better.
I think Polkadot is also sort of a hybrid. Like they have, right? They have like you'll probably talk about this later.
Finality gadgets, yeah. So. Thank you. Yeah, we like the purpose of the next talk probably Thursday. But yeah, some of the protocols combine the BFT and Nakamoto together and run BFT on top of Nakamoto. All right, so the first approach is Nakamoto consensus. I'm going to describe it in a little bit more depth. So typically in all of these protocols, the time is divided into epochs, and epochs are divided into slots. So some fixed number of slots constitute an epoch. And validators stake for an epoch. They indicate their willingness to run consensus nodes. So I focus on 2 approaches, Ouroboros and Ethereum 2.0. There are other protocols that are doing something else, but I think it's important to understand at least these 2. So here I will explain the Ouroboros design. So the leader is selected per slot from the validators who have staked for this epoch, and the leader is selected with probability proportional to its stake. So leader at a slot, it exercises this fork choice rule to figure out which chain to extend, and creates a block on top of it and proposes it to the network. So quite similar to proof of work, but an honest leader should not be proposing 2 conflicting blocks for the same slot. So it should only pick one chain and propose on top of that chain. So for example, here in slot 3, the leader was probably just faulty or failed to announce the block correctly, or maybe there were network delays or network partitions. Leader at slot 4 was clearly Byzantine because it created 2 blocks at the same height. And then it causes the chain to fork. So leader at slot 5, if it was honest, it probably heard about the top block first. So it built on top of that. Leader slot 6, if it was honest, heard about the bottom block first and built on top of that. So then you have to split ties or figure out which chain to choose to build on top of. But eventually, one of the chains will win. So Ouroboros proof of fork choice rule is pick the longest chain, the chain that has more blocks in it, and does not fork deeper than k blocks from the local chain. With k is the parameter of the protocol, but it introduces some stickiness property in that if you already know a good chain and you've been following along, you are less likely to switch to a fork, to a deep fork or deep rework.
So interesting, there is a notion, so this assumes like a global shared block, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, which like in proof of work, you don't really need to assume so much, right? So that like Bitcoin doesn't really...
Yeah, great question. Actually, the proof of work, I think the difficulty kind of depends on how frequently the blocks are generated. So difficulty is adjusted if the blocks start to appear more frequently. So in a way, it kind of judges by the time steps in the blocks how frequently they arrive. So there is still some notion of time that's required.
So you still need to keep track of like a 2-week period, roughly, where Whereas here you need to have a notion of time on a sort of much shorter time scale, I guess, the time scale of a single slot. Is that right?
Right, I agree. Right, you're right. But Ouroboros genesis, like a follow-up to the Ouroboros papers, it was getting around this assumption that you need global clock, and they were building a protocol that doesn't need that.
To follow up on that, aside from defining like what is slot 1, what is slot 2, do they actually need like synchronized local clocks, or are they like do they use it? They don't use it in any of the tie breaking or chain selection. So do they just need like some definition of what do they actually use the clocks for, other than deciding what is time slot 1, what is time slot 2, what is time 3?
Yeah, I think just deciding what the slot number it is. Let's see what else they need the clock for. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they need it for anything else.
Time is correspondent number of blocks on the chain then, because there's one block produced in each.
Well, roughly speaking, you know how quickly the chain grows. You should not be synchronizing to like an old state. So roughly speaking, you should understand that what slot is the full system right now, and how many blocks have been created, roughly at least, so that you know if you're really synchronizing to an old chain or if it's more up to date.
What does the local chain mean for the?
Oh, local chain is the one that the leader built on top of previously.
Maybe following up that, do you have a sense of what K is in practice? Is it like single digit or hundreds?
Oh, great question. I didn't look into that. That's a great question.
And then I was also going to ask, the way that they choose proportional to stake, is that still just like they have a pseudo-random number generator and it's just like everyone knows right now who's going to mine at slot 8, everyone knows who's going to mine at slot 9?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So I have a whole section on leader election process, and we'll discuss it there. And then I want to also explain the Ethereum fork choice rules, Ethereum consensus. It's different in that not only the leader is selected per slot, but also a committee is selected per slot, and the committee is supposed to attest to what the leader is proposing. So the leaders and these validators from the committee, they do fork selection according to a different fork choice rule to select the chain to build on top of. And this fork choice rule is called LMD Ghost. It was originally proposed to improve Bitcoin. The idea there is that at a slot, you look what were the latest votes that the validators in the committee casted. And these are the circles, what blocks they voted on. And so the whole tree that you know about, from which you need to select one chain, gets weighted. So all of the blocks gets weighted by the amount of validator votes that are in their subtrees. So 8 votes total, 5 votes in this subtree, 3 votes in this subtree. So, and then there is a greedy selection algorithm of a fork. So you select nodes with highest weights. So anyway, there's an interesting design choice that along the leader, you're also selecting a committee. Cool. So enormous amount of academic work as well as white papers on Nakamoto consensus. Ouroboros papers, I guess, is the most prominent from the academic side, especially since those protocols have been published in the best crypto and security conferences, Crypto, Eurocrypt, CCS, SLP, and have been, of course, reviewed by great academics. On the other hand, there are great ideas also in the white papers. And I think the white papers also deserve to be looked at and maybe analyzed from more academic perspectives, trying to prove actual consensus properties about them. So to fit into the table that I showed, proof of stake Nakamoto consensus is same as proof of work Nakamoto consensus, is that you can prove properties in synchrony, it can tolerate up to 50% Byzantine nodes, and prefers liveness over safety in case of network partitions. So the other approach is BFT consensus. I'm going to look at next. BFT consensus, scene-wise, the time is divided into epochs, and fixed number of epochs constitute a slot. You have a fixed number of validators per epoch, and 2/3 of validators are assumed to be honest.
So there.
just
You said 4 to 100, the 100 is just kind of empirically.
empirically.
Protocols
Yeah,
typing, basically.
right. I think that's what people think in practice is roughly a good number. You can always grow this to be larger, but then your consensus will be somewhat slower because you will need to collect more votes. Right, so that's just empirical. It doesn't have to be, it can be larger easily. In each slot, you also have a leader election process. So you elect a leader from the validator set, and the leader proposes a new block, and validators then work collectively to try to finalize that block, and they either arrive at a consensus decision to finalize the block, or they drop the block on the floor, and the slot is unoccupied. But the finality is deterministic, so you will know exactly when it should occur at which slot, if the network conditions are good and everybody is honest. So different protocols take different routes, but roughly you can either finalize in a single slot, within a single slot, or within 1 to 4 slots, depending on the protocol that you use. So this is my attempt to describe Tendermint in one slide. You should definitely, I recommend checking out Tim's lectures on Tendermint with a lot more details. But roughly speaking, the Tendermint consensus was the first blockchain protocol that was adapting the BFT ideas to the blockchain world. And the BFT ideas, BFT protocols have been studied for decades. So they're based on very long line of academic work. So in Tendermint consensus, you have 3 phases: pre-prepare, prepare, commit. So when the node is selected as a leader, it creates a block of transactions and broadcasts it to the rest of the network. And then the nodes vote on this block by signing it and send it to each other. Then each of the nodes, after prepare, forms a quorum certificate. A quorum certificate is a collection of 2/3 of signatures from other validators. Then they sign this quorum certificate and broadcast it to the network. So that's roughly the communication pattern in original Tendermint. Then everybody independently can arrive at the consensus decision. It's guaranteed that a good fraction will arrive at the consensus decision, then they proceed to the next leader, broadcasting a block. So as you see, the communication is quadratic because everybody is sending something to everybody else. And then hot stuff was kind of an improvement to Tendermint in 2 ways. So first of all, they observed that you can use aggregatable signatures, and you can squash these signatures collected after the end of prepare step into one signature. Or you can use threshold signatures. And you also can reroute the communication through the leader. So instead of everybody sending to everybody else, you can achieve linear communication using aggregatable signatures and rerouting through the leader. So the leader will send to everybody will send to the leader, and the leader will sort of be this rebroadcasting point of rebroadcasting the QC. But this QC quorum certificate is now constant size because of aggregatable signatures. So the second great idea of hot stuff is to pipeline block production, and you can run you can make the next leader propose a block in parallel to the first leader proposing a block at a certain stage. So you can make the network kind of send messages in parallel for parallel kind of consensus processes. It's not that simple. Just the picture to have in mind. It's not as simple as that. That's a rough idea of how this works. So the leader will collect the quorum certificate and will, after broadcasting it to the rest of the network, the next block created will include this quorum certificate inside of it and will already kind of link to the work that the first validator has done. And with this approach of linking, you can actually get rid of the rounds after the QC is formed and broadcasted. So you can kind of have this chaining of QCs at the end. And that's roughly the idea of hot stuff. And your block will be finalized after some number of QCs has been built on top of it, or some number of blocks with QCs have been absorbed on top. So hot stuff, you can think of it having a 3-chain rule. So the block B1 will get committed after there are 3 blocks with QCs built on top of it. So that's how Hot Stuff kind of conceptualized this block creation process in BFT.
For general like BFT consensus, like when you like pick in each epoch, if you have like more than 2/3 of the validators in an epoch being like Byzantine, does everything still work even like outside of that epoch?
So no, you need to compromise more than 1/3 actually. So it's a little less. You need 2/3 honest, and then at most 1/3 can be Byzantine. So if you compromise 1/3 of Byzantine, they can disrupt liveness of the protocol. So the protocol will stay safe and will not be finalizing. Wait, I'm not saying it wrong, right? Yeah, exactly. Sorry, they will be able to screw up the system. Yeah, sorry, but yeah. So if you compromise more than 1/3, the system is compromised.
So you kind of guarantee like in each epoch you have less than 1/3 Byzantine, not just like okay. So like actually you have some like concentration bound of like even if like maybe like 2/3 of all the validators being honest isn't enough, you need something like a bit stronger. Like you have like some probability, like I guess like, even if you have less than, I guess 100 Byzantine nodes in total, there's some probability in each epoch they'll get selected, right, to be leaders for that.
So you're thinking that there's some random sampling step?
Yeah,
Okay.
and like in the random sampling step, if you get very unlucky, and that just you get tons of Byzantine people in an epoch, that could be bad.
So that's why Algorand has these big committees to build them.
Yeah.
Yes, I think for what Lara said, right, I mean, she just said like assume there's almost 100 people, period.
Oh,
In which case there's no
yeah.
random sample. I mean, obviously you could have another wrapper around it
Okay.
and randomly sample down. But I think for what Lara's talking about, it's just like, there's 100 nodes, hopefully 67 are doing it correctly.
I see.
And
Okay.
if not, who knows? So, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you're doing subsampling of committees, then you need to make sure with high probability you will not have more than 1/3 of Byzantine there in your subsample.
Okay.
So I guess that will require a somewhat stronger assumption on the overall number of Byzantine nodes.
So quick question. So first of all, these pictures are super helpful for visualizing that stuff. I think really good, yeah. For the aggregatable signatures, like what's the most sort of practical instantiation? Like what would you actually use if you wanted to do that?
Oh, fantastic question. I would use BLS, but there is a caveat we were exploring with Miranda, is that BLS signatures are not actually aggregatable to constant size signatures. You still need to provide the bit vector who have signed in order to be able to verify. And that bit vector, although in practice it's super small, maybe you can assume it's constant and insignificant, still it's a linear size vector. So technically speaking, BLS is not aggregatable to constant size. Hot Stuff paper is proposed, but it's good in practice. I think it's for all purposes, it's fine to use BLS. And that's what Ethereum, by the way, is using BLS for signature aggregation. Ethereum consensus layer. Hot Stuff is proposing using threshold signatures. And for threshold signatures, to create a signature, you can do it in one round. You can do it with EDDSA signatures, which are relatively popular. But you need to have some pre-processing round of generating the distributed key jointly. So that complicates the protocol quite a bit in practice. And I don't think people kind of like it for their consensus layer.
So are there any deployed projects which actually use threshold signatures?
No, I haven't seen the BFT projects employ that. By the way, still research is very active in the area of threshold signatures and how, especially in distributed key generation, of how to do that efficiently. The simplest protocols also involve somewhat heavy machinery of NISICs, non-interactive zero-knowledge proofs. To make it efficient, you need to introduce another assumption, which comes from Polyea crypto system. And it starts being a little scary, maybe.
But there's hope it will get more practical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Soon,
Yeah. But many projects, by the way, build the threshold signatures for other purposes, not just to underline the consensus protocol, but on top of that, have, for example, for custody, if you want to split your key between parties and make them jointly create a signature for you, such that you need large participation to sign your transaction. So I think that's these are the projects that are now driving this research in threshold signatures. Yeah, great point. Academic works on BFT, So these are the 4 that I want to highlight. So PBFT is from '99. It has nothing to do with blockchains, but it was surprisingly very easy to adapt to the blockchain setting. The Tendermint was an adaptation of PBFT. So as I said, the protocol is quadratic. We haven't covered the case of a malicious leader. It's somewhat more involved to explain on the slide, but in leader failure, there is something else you need to add to the protocol to handle that. So Tendermint was doing switching of the leaders in also quadratic time. The Tendermint consensus, unfortunately, is not responsive, and that's why hot stuff was built, is criticizing Tendermint for not having responsiveness, which means that the protocol cannot proceed with network speeds, and hot stuff can. So if your network is fine, everybody is honest, you can just finalize. You can finalize faster if your network becomes faster, but with Tendermint you have some lock steps that don't allow you to move to the next round as quickly. This PBFT protocol, PBFT, Tendermint, and hot stuff, they work in partial synchrony. And interestingly, research in synchronous protocols also continues. So I was saying maybe synchronous assumption is not that bad in practice. And synchronous PBFT is just 3 years old. A very nice protocol with linear communication that's also responsive.
It looks like hot stuff, that row dominates strictly synchronous BFT, but they're like the same year. Are there any benefits of synchronous BFT over hot stuff?
Great question. I think this protocol is simpler. And that's the main benefit just for implementation purposes. But yeah, you can go well with hot stuff too. Right, so to map it back to our table, this is the kind of protocols typically work in partial synchrony, can tolerate up to 33% of Byzantine nodes. And in the event of network partition, they choose safety over liveness, so they completely halt and are not finalizing any blocks. Great, so going back just to the picture, just to reiterate that finality is probabilistic in Nakamoto consensus and immediate in BFT. And yeah, depending on which properties you would prefer, liveness or safety, you would choose one of them. More of the recent protocols they prefer, I guess, at least the trend that I've observed, tend to prefer the BFT-style consensus, just because the finality is immediate and you can also scale the protocols are better understood. So in these protocols, it's possible to have really fast finality and really large throughput, especially if you don't have too many validators. Right, and also BFT protocols are somewhat more accountable. So if there is a safety violation or if there's some problem with the protocol, it's kind of easy to see why if you observe the history of how everybody voted in the BFT system, rather than kind of analyze this more permissionless systems where a lot depends on network delays, especially in case of network partitions, you don't have safety. I wanted to dedicate one slide to staking design choices, just maybe to have something for later discussions. So validators in all of these protocols, they stake coins as somehow indicate that they're willing to run the nodes. And the required staking amount can be either fixed, that's the Ethereum approach, you have to stake 32 ETH to be a validator, or it can be variable. And the more you stake, the more likely you are to be elected as leader and the more rewards you get. Then I also wanted to highlight the delegated proof of stake. It allows stakeholders to delegate their stake to validators. And you imagine in practice there will be participants in the system who have a lot of stake but just don't have the technical capability to run nodes. So it's likely they want to lend their stake to validators who can run nodes, and then they can split the reward. So this kind of delegation would probably happen naturally in any system. It just is more accountable and more safe if it's baked into the protocol somehow, so that you don't purely trust your validator to use your stake correctly and to give you back the reward. You actually can revoke this right, etc. So Many systems have this delegation mechanism in place.
Okay, and isn't Ethereum sort of unique in not having it?
Yeah, but in a way they do. They separate kind of the consensus key and the withdrawal key. So if you're a validator, you can have withdrawal key that allows you to withdraw from the validator set and get back your stake with the withdrawal key, and you can keep it to yourself. And then the consensus key, you can embed the node's key as a consensus key, and it will be signing on your behalf. So in a way, they kind of allow this separation of validator. But yeah, indeed, the fact that they have fixed stake doesn't quite naturally kind of fit into the delegated proof of stake model. Some protocols, as you were mentioning, want to limit the number of validators, and then they will need to do some random selection of a subcommittee and make sure there are enough good nodes in the subcommittee. Or they can also take a more centralized approach, like the current committee can decide who joins and who leaves. And I wanted also to show this table of how much is staked in different cryptocurrencies right now. And this is ordered by the market cap of the staked amount. So just 10% of Ethereum is so big that it dominates the rest. But it was surprising to me that these amounts are super high. So Ethereum has 10% of its total supply staked, Solana has 75%, Cardano 71%, Avalanche 58%, etc. So I don't know, I'll leave it to the economists to kind of figure if this is a good thing to have or not, because the stake is typically idle, not transacting, just sitting there. Great, so that's on staking. And now I'll move to more technical part, leader election strategies, and also the tool subsume committee election strategies. So what are the goals of the leader election? So yeah, again, we have this epochs and slots, and the leader is elected per slot to propose a block, and the leader is rewarded for proposing a good block. And if typically in the protocols, if the leader violates the protocol and it is observed by someone, this can be presented as a proof to the protocol, and the leader will get slashed. So the leader election properties, the leader election can either be public or private. And public means that the outcome of the leader election process is visible to all participants at the same time, including the leader. So the leader learns that he became a leader at the same time everybody else learns. And private leader election is the leader checks herself whether she was elected or not, and she can then prove to the network that she was elected. So she has this a little bit of a delay, and she can take this time to prepare a block and then announce herself as a leader together with the block. And it's nice for DDoS protection, as we'll see, because once the leader announces, then the adversary will not know whom to attack, who the leader is, until the leader reveals itself. But when the leader reveals itself, it also has already broadcasted a block, so there is no purpose of attacking it. It's already done its job. And the leader election properties that we want is typically fairness. So the leader election probability should be proportional to their stake. Although different protocols define fairness in different other ways, some favor leaders who were good leaders in the past, like the BFT, for example, it has the reputation system. Or you can maybe not be willing to elect the leader that has the most stake too often and make it a little bit more decentralized. So fairness is typically easy to achieve if you define it well. Unbiasability is somewhat harder to achieve, as we'll see. So unbiasability means that nobody should be able to influence the leader election in its favor. So if I'm the current leader, I should not be able to make myself a leader more frequently in the subsequent slots. And unpredictability basically means DDoS resistance. So for an attacker observing the leader election process should not be able to predict who the leader will be at some future slot, so that it cannot prepare a DDoS attack on it. It's surprising that this leader election can be generalized to solve more general, more interesting problems. So if we design a leader election process that's public, unbiased, and unpredictable, these three properties will give a randomness beacon. The randomness beacon is this common coin that the asynchronous protocols need in order to be built. And this can also provide randomness API for smart contracts, not just in asynchronous, in any consensus. So smart contracts can, if you have a randomness beacon in your protocol, they can have an access to random bits. They can have get random API. And for example, that's useful for lotteries if you want to figure out who the leader is randomly. Randomness beacon will allow you to do that. So the problem, although we'll be focusing on leader election here, the problem is more generic.
So when you say, how should I interpret these quality signs?
Sorry.
So you would assert that if you can actually have all of these properties, then you may as well use it as a randomness beacon. Interesting. Is that, should I interpret that as a positive statement or a negative statement, right? Like it's like a reduction, right? So randomness beacons reduced to good public leader election. Does that mean randomness beacons are easier than we thought, but the public leader election is like harder than we thought?
Harder, yeah. Well, we'll see protocols for randomness beacons, so they have been built.
Okay.
So there are positive results on that side. But also you'll see these protocols are not simple. So maybe you can interpret that as a negative result. Cool. So we'll start with the more straightforward leader election process, which is round robin. So the leaders are chosen one after the other in some lexicographical order, or equivalently, this is deterministic leader election. So the leaders are chosen as a function of the slot number. This leader election process is public. Of course, everybody knows who the leader is together with the leader. It's easy to make fair. It's also unbiasable because there is no way you can bias round robin. It's predetermined. But unfortunately, it is predictable. So if the validators don't have good DDoS protection, you can figure out in which schedule to take them down in order for the consensus to halt and not be able to make any progress. But before we kind of discard this design, it's actually good for leaders with good DDoS protection. And for the M blockchain, for example, we reasoned that this is good enough because there, the validators were known entities with very good infrastructure and they could afford being DDoS protected. So that was not a problem. And this leader election was fitting there perfectly fine. But for more permissionless systems, this of course needs to be enhanced.
Because another thing which, if you were doing longest chain consensus, like Matt's written papers saying how like things like selfish mining get worse if you have predictability.
Right.
But if you're doing, I think at DM you were doing a BFT type protocol, so it may not have mattered for you, but for longest chain there are other issues.
Interesting.
Is that?
That's correct.
I see.
Can I also ask, you have public versus private, you're saying private is better if the leader learns that they're a leader in advance of the public?
Yes, because it has this time to prepare a block, because it typically takes a few seconds for it to pack transactions together to make sure you execute them, they're all executing correctly. So typically there is some delay you want before you announce yourself as a leader to be able to prepare this block.
That doesn't sound like a public versus private issue though, that like here it's public, but like I know now that I'm gonna be the leader like 15 years from now and I can, like it sounds like I can prepare my block very well in advance if it's round robin.
Oh yeah, it's not solving the problem of giving you more time to prepare a block, it's solving the problem of shrinking the DDoS window.
Got it, okay, yeah, got it.
Then I was thinking it was fun to look at leader election approach in Ethereum consensus layer that's running right now. It's called RunDAO mechanism. So this is a picture from their specification. Leader of the previous epoch contribute verifiable deterministic randomness. If you know how BLS signatures work, think of BLS signing epoch numbers. So they contribute this verifiable deterministic randomness to the next epoch. So RunDAO reveal kind of mixes their randomness into RunDAO mix. And then Randall mix is used to elect all the leaders in the next epoch. So the epoch is 32 slots. So you see here that the Randall mix from slot n plus 96 is influencing leader election of slot n plus 128. So that's exactly 32 slots in advance, one epoch in advance. Leader schedule gets known one epoch in advance. It's also public, so the leader learns they're going to be the leader at the same time the public learns. And there is unpredictability is one epoch in advance, so the adversary will have one epoch of DDoS window to try to prepare the attack to take that leader down. This protocol is biasable. The last leader to reveal Randall mix, to add to Randall mix can choose just to drop out of the protocol instead of revealing his randomness and contributing his randomness, and that way he gets one bit of bias for the resulting value, either dropping out or contributing. It cannot contribute different values because the process is deterministic. It's deterministic randomness.
This is whether they choose to sign, contribute to the signature?
Yeah, and there's only one signature possible because BLS signatures have this nice property of uniqueness. You only can generate one signature on a message. Yeah, so
quick question. Maybe I didn't hear you well, but so if one attacker has many different accounts and can choose to reveal any subset of them, does that mean they have more than one bit, or is this somehow prevented?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, great question. Yeah, if you have some k number of Byzantine leaders in succession, you can influence the output by k bits. You're right, absolutely. So yeah, it becomes larger than one bit if you have more Byzantine leaders in a row. But they still argue that's small enough to work.
Can you clarify, so you mentioned like the last leader, is this BLS signing is a sequential protocol that orders people, or everyone signs at the same time and last just refers to whoever happens to speak last?
No, so the leader schedule is predetermined, so you know who will be signing for each slot. So last means is that just the last leader of the epoch has a little bit of bias on the randomness in the future, and maybe you're asking about how the leader is chosen. So the leader is chosen from the validator set that also gets fixed a little bit in advance. So when you seed your randomness and your validator set through some random selection, that as an output you get your committees, your schedule of leaders. Yeah, shard chain proposers, they don't do right now, but does that answer your question?
I think you answered the question. I'm still confused. So this is the protocol they use to select the leader for like the next block or the next epoch, or they select a sequence of leaders for the next epoch? Yeah,
they select a sequence of leaders for the epoch next to the next.
Okay, so. And then in addition to being a leader who proposes blocks, the leader also has the option of contributing to the Randall, or Randall is just completely disjoint?
No, it's exactly the same leaders that are contributing to Randall and proposing blocks.
Okay, and then you said that when so you said basically I can propose a block. So you said my options are either don't propose a block at all, or propose a block and contribute my BLS signature.
Exactly.
And if I propose a block and contribute my BLS signature, then that will mix in with the randomness, and then at the end there's some deterministic function that takes as input everyone's BLS signatures and says, this is the seed, this determines the leaders for the entire next epoch.
Yes. Yeah, so the leader can either propose the block and his randomness reveal, or propose nothing. You know the block, no randomness. So it's either both or none.
Okay. And then the leaders for the next epoch are fully known the moment that epoch begins?
Yes.
Okay.
Even one epoch in advance.
Got it. And then roughly how many, oh, you already said, never mind. So an epoch is like 6.4
minutes.
And that corresponds to like
32 slots, each slot is 12 seconds.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
The fact that this is biasable doesn't qualify this leader election as a randomness beacon. So you cannot use it in lotteries, for example. But as we'll see...
They're still using longest chain to determine the block, so they have some consensus protocol.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, they use longest chain and BFT on top of longest chain. So they have somewhat complicated fork selection rule that takes into account the fork choice rule as well as what the BFT layer was saying.
And the fork choice rule you mentioned earlier, right? You talked about LND Ghost.
Yeah, LND Ghost.
So that's the fork choice rule.
That's the fork choice rule. And I didn't explain the BFT layer. That will I explain on Thursday.
But on Thursday you will, right?
Yeah.
Can you just quickly say, is the BFT layer happening within an epoch, or the BFT layer is like multiple epochs long, or?
Yeah, it's multiple epochs long, so still your time to finality is about 2 epochs, 12, 13 seconds.
Okay, so fair to think like roughly within an epoch, it's or not exactly longest chain, but then it's the fork selection rule.
Mm-hmm.
And then every epoch or 2 epochs, they do BFT to sync up.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Cool. Great. So
within an epoch, they're still using a fork selection rule, and the leaders are fully known in advance, so they would still be vulnerable to these like predictable selfish mining attacks, because within an epoch, all the miners are known, and they're using something like longest chain.
Well, I'm not sure about selfish. Maybe you should discuss this offline.
The basic issue is that in proof of work selfish mining, whenever you try to do something clever, there's always some risk that you're going to actually lose a block you would have gotten otherwise. Right? You do some sort of like private mining, then if honest miners sort of succeed before you extend your private chain, then you lose. So it's this non-trivial like cost-benefit analysis.
I see.
Whereas if you knew in advance exactly which rounds you were going to leader, you just do all of that in your head, and you just like, so it makes it sort of riskless in a sense. Is that right?
Yeah, or basically like anytime you know that you are going to mine 2 blocks in a row, that is an opportunity to cancel someone else's block and get more revenue for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. If you can compromise leaders in succession. But hopefully at some point there will be an honest leader. So it's not like you only have a few bits of bias here to make yourself more likely to be a leader for next.
Yeah, so it doesn't, I agree with you. Liveness and safety should be fine, I would think.
I agree.
But the fairness of the reward distribution is what
I
gets
see.
messed up.
Okay. And then, so these are the designs that are both unbiasable and unpredictable, but are public, and these are protocols for randomness beacon construction. And as we were saying, this is also good for leader election, for public leader election. But it's more generic in that it can also power random lotteries, give randomness API to smart contracts, and also help bootstrap asynchronous consensus. The star here means that your underlying random beacon protocol should be asynchronous as well in order to bootstrap asynchronous consensus, and not all of them are asynchronous. So this is good for leaders that are hard to DDoS within the time it takes to create and broadcast the proposal, usually a few seconds. So I will briefly highlight you these 2 approaches, the VDF one and the threshold signature one. This will be as technical as it will get, sorry. But the VDF-based leader election, and I encourage you to watch Joe's talk on VDFs to understand that better. VDF is a verifiable delay function. The idea is to pass your randomness through a VDF to make it unbiasable. So a verifiable delay function is, roughly speaking, the setup will output a single public key, and the evaluation will take this public key and an input X, output the result of the evaluation Y, together with the proof that this result is correct. Evaluation is taking very long, but it is very fast to verify that the result is correct. If somebody has spent a lot of time computing Y and the proof, it will be able to show you the Y and the proof, and you will be able to quickly say whether that's correct or not. So that's why I delay a long time to verify, a long time to evaluate. And some VDFs require trusted setups, some do not. There are different constructions for VDFs. And to make your beacon unbiasable, you just apply the VDF on top of it. So roughly speaking, when the party can have some bias window in which it can pick randomness from a set, and hoping that figuring out which one of them to pick will help them become a leader more frequently later on. So there is a little bit of window between the party knowing the set already from which it can choose and revealing the randomness. So delta bias is that interval. If you pass your randomness through a VDF, and where VDF takes longer to evaluate than your bias interval, then you make it impossible for the party to predict the randomness before revealing it, right? It will have to reveal the randomness before it knows what it will be. So it can definitely try to run the VDFs on every member of the set in parallel, but it will need to reveal the randomness before the evaluation is complete. So yeah, that way you can get an unbiasable leader election from biasable ones if you apply VDF. Great, another approach. I'll go fast here because I think it may be harder to understand if you haven't seen threshold signatures before. So the setup in threshold signature-based leader election collectively generates a secret key. A secret key has this property that it can be reconstructed from any threshold subset of shares. So each party holds a share of the secret key. Any 2/3 of them can get together to reconstruct the original key, and it will be the same key regardless of which subset gets together. Parties will collectively sign a slot number by submitting signature shares. So there is a signing process that allows you to sign with a share of the secret key, not the full secret key. So your message will be the slot number, and your secret key will be a share. You'll produce a share of the signature, and then they will be able to reconstruct full signature from the shares. And the hash of the signature is your randomness beacon. So of course, communication doesn't have to be that big. You can always pipeline your communication through a leader. And there is, I think, only one scheme we know that you require to have unique signatures for this to work. And there's only one unique signature that's friendly through thresholdization, which is BLS. And there's a notable project, right? So this threshold signature randomness beacon powers DRAND project. It's a very interesting project. It's all open source, and basically, a League of Entropy is a collection of companies that get together to run this distributed protocol in generating randomness beacons. And you go to their website. You have a hexadecimal string that gets updated every few seconds with fresh randomness. And as long as threshold of them stays honest, you get verifiable, unpredictable, unbiasable random numbers as a service.
So they're not using the VDF, right?
No, they're using BLS.
So do they have this last person problem?
Oh, sorry, last person problem.
Where like the last person that can decide whether or not to contribute a signature, or? Well,
that kind of protocol is totally like in parallel to your consensus protocol. So it doesn't quite fit into this RANDAO mixed paradigm where you have a leader contribution. But definitely you're saying maybe, well, there are issues like that inside the construction of this protocol itself. But the protocol has a way to deal with that.
Which is not a VDF, some other way of dealing with it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it the same signature that's reconstructed regardless of whether it's like 2/3 n plus 1 or like 2/3 n plus 2 people signing?
Yeah.
Because then in that case, it seems like the last person to sign doesn't have influence beyond like deciding whether it fails or deciding whether it passes.
Yeah, fantastic question. Yeah, that's independent of who have signed or how many of them have signed. And that's because the signatures are unique. So there can only ever be one signature, full signature for any message. So if you were able to reconstruct a signature, it's guaranteed to only depend on the secret key that's independent of the subset and the slot number. So
if for some reason you were pivotal, if you knew there were exactly 2/3 N other people and you knew what they contributed, then you could cancel the randomness if you wanted, I guess. That's like the one thing you could do.
yeah, that's one you could stop the protocol. Yeah, threshold of Byzantine part is the same as BFT assumption. Kind of if you go over the threshold.
That's what you're saying. If
you
you're after
break
that would never happen anyways. Okay, fair enough.
And so why does Ethereum not use this and make themselves susceptible to the last whatever problem?
Yeah, great question. I think the argument that they make is the leader needs to prepare, which I'm not sure why, but they think that it's a desirable property actually to have a little bit of window between the leader knowing it's going to be the leader and it becoming a leader. So for that reason, they see it as a benefit to have this window, although they're of course making the leader subject to DDoS probably attack. And on the other hand, also the Randall mix, it also uses BLS signatures, just not threshold version. And this is very involved protocol, like this, especially the distributed key generation part. So it just, maybe they will eventually do that. It's just a lot of stuff to implement. Very quickly, I want to also highlight the VRF-based leader election that makes the leader election private, solving the last desirable property. VRF, don't confuse with VDF. These are two very different cryptographic schemes, protocols, although they're named roughly the same. VRF stands for verifiable random function. It also has three algorithms. The setup outputs the secret public key pair. The evaluation takes the secret key. The VDF that I showed you didn't take the secret key, but only the owner of the secret key can evaluate the VRF, get the output and the proof, but anybody can verify the output and the proof that they match X. So there's nothing why it should be indistinguishable from random, hence verifiable random function. And they can be instantiated from unique signatures like BLS or RSA. So each leader will use this primitive to determine whether he is a leader. He will take his secret key, assuming that his public key is known to everybody else, and it will evaluate basically X being a slot number with his secret key, and will get Y and the proof pi. And if his Y is less than some threshold, the leader, he's elected as a leader. So the leader creates a block and broadcasts it together with the proof pi. There is no DDoS window, as I was explaining. The leader has already fulfilled its responsibility, also revealing itself. But there is a kind of major problem where this approach is difficult to implement just as a building block into your consensus protocols, that multiple leaders can get elected, or sometimes none of the leaders can get elected. So you can imagine several leaders will have their value less than threshold, or maybe none. And so your consensus protocol needs to be able to handle that. It needs to be able to handle multiple leaders or non-leaders. Algorand, I guess, was the first protocol to be designed to deal with that. Just to go back to the properties that all of these protocols achieve, so round-robin, deterministic, it's unbiasable, but unfortunately predictable. So the DDoS window is really high. The rundown of Ethereum is a little bit biasable, a couple of bits of bias. It's somewhat unpredictable. You can predict the leader like 6 minutes in advance. So your DDoS window is 6 minutes. The random beacons ones are better, and the DDoS window is a couple seconds that it takes for the leader to propose a block. But they're not private, and if you really don't want any DDoS windows there, then you should use the VRF-based approach that satisfies all of those properties. Great, so in the last couple of minutes, I just want to highlight a few interesting consensus protocols that I didn't color code. This is Algorand, where you can have multiple leaders per slot. So they also make other interesting design choices. Particularly, they don't make nodes log their tokens, so there's no slashing, so it's really safe to be a leader. You only get rewarded. user registers. The user still needs to indicate his willingness to run consensus node, so he needs to register the participation key. Each node runs a VRF twice, similar to Ethereum consensus layer, once to figure out if he was elected as a leader, and the other time to figure out if he was elected as a member of a committee. And the committee will be voting on leader proposals. So there could be multiple leaders per round who are proposing block, and the blocks start propagating through the network. And so there's this fork choice component in that you need to choose one of the blocks. And the way they choose one of them is just the lowest block by hash. You choose that block and you get that block propagated. And then in BFT-style consensus, the committee votes twice on a block to get it finalized. The other interesting choice they make is making their keys forward secure. So we'll discuss this more on Thursday, but the leaders and validators, they rotate their keys, kind of discarding the old keys to invalidate the possibility of long-range attacks. Algorand is also network partition resilient, but it resumes when the network is restored quite efficiently. The other protocol I want to highlight is Avalanche. It doesn't have leader election process altogether. It's a leaderless consensus protocol. It's a very nice idea. Their consensus protocol is called Snowball or Snowman. It was originally described in the UTXO model, thus transactions form a DAG, directed acyclic graph, and this consensus establishes partial order of the transactions. So roughly it works as follows. So each node accepts a valid transaction TX1 when it hears about it, and sends it to other nodes, like rebroadcasts to peers, until it sees a conflicting transaction TX2, in which case it needs to figure out which one to choose, either TX1 or TX2, and then it asks its peers, what do they think is the transaction that they're willing to include. If TX2 gets more votes, then it switches to TX2. If TX1 gets more votes, it switches to TX2 and rebroadcasts it also. If didn't get many votes, you stick to TX1. So the finality is probabilistic, and eventually kind of the full chain collapses to believing either transaction 1 or transaction 2. Okay, so that's Avalanche. And finally, I think this is my last slide. I want to show different attacks on proof-of-stake consensus. And this is rather a glossary. Like, I'm sure you can figure out these attacks yourself, because they all are a consequence of costless simulation. Basically, you don't need to solve proof-of-work mining puzzles, which are very expensive. It's very easy to create alternative forks. Just for the glossary, kind of, because the projects have settled on these terms. So nothing at stake is relevant to Nakamoto consensus when a rational validator will work on all possible forks, trying to maximize him being elected as leader on all of these forks, and eventually kind of hoping to collect more reward. This is typically mitigating by slashing for double voting. So voting for two conflicting forks at the same height constitutes a slashing condition that can be presented to the protocol, and this validator will get his stake revoked, or some substantial amount will be deducted. Stake grinding attack is exactly biasing leader election by manipulating the randomness. It's also mitigated, as we're seeing, by good and biasable leader election strategies. There's also risk of centralization. So if the code base is correct, everybody is behaving honestly, then kind of wealthy individuals will become even more wealthy, because they will, since the reward is proportional to stake, they will grow even more stake from block rewards. So there is this centralization that will be happening in a good behaving system, and I guess people are proposing mitigating that with some proper incentivization or taxation of wealthy nodes. And then on Thursday, we will discuss long-range attacks. So what if you compromise historical consensus keys, or you compromise nodes who were very wealthy in the past, and then you get the ability to completely influence the fork that gets built from that point onwards, because you will be controlling the majority of the stake, or some necessary fraction of it. And we will see the ways to mitigate that on Thursday. And stake bleeding attack is also a form of long-range attack where the attacker can collect minting rewards in his alternative chain that he doesn't reveal to anybody else, but he gets wealthier and wealthier there until at some point he gets enough stake so that it violates the Byzantine threshold, and then he has full control of the fork. There is a very nice survey I recommend, and kind of reading more about these attacks and also different consensus approaches, not just the ones that I described, but there are also proof of authority, for example, proof of elapsed time, proof of history, proof of what else? Proof of storage, etc. So it's very interesting also to check out these other protocols. I recommend the survey from IEEE. Okay, that's all I have.